So when I talk about Daniel, if I just mention Daniel, first of all, how many of you grew up singing like songs like "How Great Thou Art"? If you grew up in church, yeah, is that a you know for old Lutherans, is that a you guys sing that in the Lutheran church? "How Great Thou Art"? Is that not so much a Lutheran song? So you guys knew that. You guys did, okay. Some of you know that. Well, Daniel, you go back. Daniel, when I say Daniel, what might pop to mind? Lion's Den. Yep, Daniel in the Lion's Den. There's some real key stories from Daniel, and we're going to hit on some of those here this morning. All the stories in Daniel, and there's several of them. We're going to only look at about the first 6 chapters of the book. Like, holy cow, we're covering 6 chapters a day. I promise that we won't be here all morning. So we're going to do the fast track on looking at Daniel today. But pretty much all the stories we're going to look at, all these famous stories, deal with one issue. And that issue is, how do we survive, even to one extent, how do we thrive, how do we live, how do we make it in a culture that doesn't always make sense, or that we don't always fit into very well. And if we think about it, I think that's probably true in some ways. You think about all the things that go on. You may have been keeping track of the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin case that just it just finished legally, but I doubt that's over. You've got that coming up. You've got all sorts of political issues going on. We were watching the news this morning, and there's all sorts of things going on that's both sad, and they can be tragic. We saw trains derailing. There's another shooting in, or was it Florida? There's all sorts of things going on, and sometimes our culture just doesn't make sense, especially if we're people who are trying to follow Christ. How do we make sense? How do we live? It's hard enough sometimes to live in the culture in which we find ourselves, let alone thrive as people who try to follow Christ. Now, I certainly wouldn't argue that things are any worse today than they were decades ago or hundreds of years ago. I don't think it's any worse than it is, but we face different challenges, don't we? And I think every Christian, all the way back to Daniel, and we're talking about a couple thousand years here, every Christian in every culture faces this issue. How do we live? How do we thrive? How do we survive in a culture which we don't always fit in? Okay? You might say, well, how do we not fit in? As Christians or as people, this is our home, isn't it? This is where we live. This is our culture. In one sense, it's home. Daisy, how old were you when you moved here? You were 35. So you grew up in the Indian culture in India, and then you moved here, and by now this has become your home. So this is home, and so this is home for all of us. It's what we know. Okay, so it's comfortable. On the other hand, though, as we attempt to follow Christ, I think we all experience a sense of, even though this is home and this is what we know, as Christians or as people who are trying to follow Christ, it isn't quite home, is it? We run into issues where we don't fit in with what the world wants us to do or has us to do. We clash at times, don't we, with what God would have us to do and what our society or what our culture has us to do. How many of you have ever felt that way, that there is a tension there between living here on earth or in Farmington or Apple Valley or Dakota County or whatever, but also trying to be a Christian at the same time? How many of you have ever felt that tension? I know I have. It can be a struggle at times to do both of those things. And I think Daniel this morning is going to help us out. How do we manage that tension between living here and being Christians and being faithful people to what God wants us to do? How do we manage, or how do we navigate those waters? That's what Daniel's going to help us do this morning, all right? So let's look at Daniel, okay? So Daniel, and we got to do just a little bit of history this morning. And Daniel, okay, like the Hebrew people, the people in Judah, those, we've been talking about, those are all the same people, right? The people of Israel, the people of Judah, that's the same people. But in about 605, 600 years before Christ, people called the Babylonians come in, all right, and start kicking them out of their place where they lived. That still happens today. People move in and kick other people out. Okay? And so the Babylonians come in and they start taking the Israelites out and shipping them off to Babylon, probably like modern day Iran or somewhere like that, wherever I think that's modern day Babylon. Okay, so they start taking the Israelites out of their land and shipping them off to other countries, other lands. Okay, and that was popular. When you overran a country, you didn't want the people revolting or having riots against you, so you shipped their people off to other countries. You kind of divided them up so they couldn't rebel or riot or overthrow you. And so that's what's happening. The Babylonians have moved in, and now they're shipping off some of the Hebrew people, the Israelites, off back to Babylon. All right, so let's read this here. We're just going to read the first 7 verses of Daniel chapter 1, and I think it's going to be up here. Brad, are you going to thumb down through there? Thank you. All right, you're going to try. Brad's doing double duty back there. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Okay, so this is about 605. Nebuchadnezzar, he's a Babylonian. He comes into Judah, Israel, same thing. Well, technically for our purposes, the same thing. And he besieges it. Okay, he's coming in and he lays waste to the land. Verse 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. So he delivers the people into the hand of the Babylonians, so the Babylonians take over, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. That's going to come into play later. So some of the articles are things like silverware, dishes, cups, stuff like that, things that were used in the temple, okay? So keep that in mind. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put it in the treasure house of his God. So everybody with me there? The Babylonians have come in and shipping stuff back to Babylon. Does that make sense? Everybody with me there so far? And then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained there for 3 years. After that, they were to enter the king's service. So notice here, not only is Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, taking these articles of gold, silver, like the silverware, junk like that. Not junk, stuff like that. How's that? He's taking the cream of the crop of the people, too. He's taking the best of the best, the brightest of the bright, removing them and bringing that to Babylon. He's taking the smartest people and bringing them into his service, in his palace, in his kingdom, back in Babylon. So he's taking the smartest and bringing them back with him, okay? Still with me there? He's taking not only their goods, but he's taking their people, their smartest people as well. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names, okay? And these are probably their better-known names. To Daniel, the name of Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. All right? So those are your... What are those 3 people? If you grew up with your Bible stories, what are those people known for? Those 3 latter people. The fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The fiery furnace. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But Daniel resolved not to... Okay, that's it. That's all the further I want to go. All right, so the story from now on is going to revolve around these 4 guys. Daniel, who's been renamed, and then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's going to revolve around these 4 guys who have been shipped off back to where? Shipped off to where? Babylon. They've been taken out of Jerusalem and sent back to Babylon, and they're 4 very smart guys who showed aptitude for learning. So again, here we go. So throughout their tenure in Babylon, they are going to face hostility. Living in the Babylonian culture, they're essentially slaves. They're not going back voluntarily, but they're going to face opposition both overtly, covertly, or subtly as they serve in this kingdom, okay? So, the first 6 chapters of this book, we are given 3 fairly famous stories, okay? And one less famous one. We are given Daniel, let's see, what are they? We are given the fiery furnace, okay? We are given the writing on the wall. Has anybody heard of that one, the writing on the wall? Who's heard of the writing on the wall one? Anybody heard of that one? A few of you. And then we're given Daniel and the lion's den. So we're going to spend about like 2 minutes on each of those. And then we're going to look at 4 points after that on what do we bring out of these stories that tell us how do we function, how do we live in a society where we don't necessarily fit in, okay? So let's look at these 4 stories, all right? Let's really quickly look at the first one. The first one is in chapter 1, all right? Chapter 1, verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. That's back from verse 5. The king's given them his food. And Daniel says, all right, I'm not going to eat his food or drink his wine. Why? I don't know. And the Bible doesn't tell us. He just decides, I'm not going to do that. Now, people have theories on why, but I don't really know. Nothing quite fits. Nothing fits that, it might have been tainted or it might have been sacrificed to idols. Maybe not. There's problems with all those theories. Simply put, for some reason, Daniel decides not to eat the food or drink the wine that's given to him by the king, okay? And so as this story unfolds, essentially Daniel says no, and he is provided with simple vegetables and simple grains instead of this fancy food from the king, and it's a test. It's the test to see if this lower grade food is going to keep him and his people, keep him and the other 3 healthy, better than the king's food, his good food, and his rich food, and his rich wine. And what happens? Anybody know? Yeah, they turn out better. They're just as healthy or more healthy than if they would have eaten the king's food and the king's wine. So that's the first story. Not near as well known as the other one. So they survive on this lesser quality food, okay? And verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and all the enchanters in his whole kingdom. Okay? So they're thriving. These 4 guys are absolutely thriving. They're not only surviving, but they are rising above the native inhabitants. These Hebrews that are brought in are doing even better than the natives. Okay? So let's move on to the second one. There's some dreams that go on. Daniel's an interpreter of a dream. He's in there with the magicians and the whatever the guys are over there, the mystic people. That's what he is. He's brought in, and they're all these 4 trained as magicians, sorcerers, whatever you want to call it. So he's in there with them interpreting dreams and all sorts of stuff. So verse 3, let's go to a more well-known chapter 3, another well-known story, and that's the image of gold in the fiery furnace. Any of your kids watch the Veggie Tales? Anybody seen those Veggie Tales? What's the fiery furnace one? It's Rack Shack and Benny, and they got the giant pickle. I think they have to worship the giant pickle or something like that. So that I would show that, only it's like a half hour long. I don't think you want to be in here for that long. But essentially the fiery furnace. So what happens? Okay, they're still over there. They're still functioning. Nebuchadnezzar is still in power, and he erects some sort of really tall statue and says, everybody out here, when all these musical instruments play, everybody has to bow down to this statue that I have built. Okay, and anybody who doesn't bow down is going to be thrown into this probably kiln, this very hot furnace that's used for probably smelting or whatever they used it for. Okay, and so they're all there. Daniel is probably not here. He's probably in a different part of the empire because he's not mentioned. So he's probably elsewhere. So we just have the latter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so when the music sounds, everybody bows down except whom? These 3 guys, these 3 non-Babylonians, these 3 Hebrews who worship a different God, who worships the God of the Bible. They refuse to bow down, okay? And Nebuchadnezzar says, all right, guys, you're going to get another chance. I'm going to sound the instruments again. If you don't bow down, you're going into the furnace. All right, guys, let's get it together. All right? And so the music sounds, and what happens? They don't bow down. They don't bow down, okay? So let's see here. How far here? Verse 13 of chapter 3. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men were brought before the king. The king said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" Skipping down a few verses, "But if you do not worship, I will throw you immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reply. This is a great reply. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." How interesting is that response? What's our first response whenever we are accused of something, or whenever somebody does something? We defend ourselves. So, well, here's the reason why. They don't do that. You notice Jesus didn't do that either. When he was accused, if anybody knows the story, what does it say that Jesus did when he was accused, before Pilate? He didn't say a dang thing. He just kept his mouth shut. How much could we learn from that? Just keeping our mouths shut. Okay? "Oh God, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." And then guess what? Nebuchadnezzar is still furious with them. He throws them in the furnace, okay? He throws them in this fire furnace so hot that all his people die, okay? All his people die that throw them in there. And what happens? They don't burn, okay? He sees a fourth person in there, like a son of the gods, is what he says. And they are brought out, and they don't burn. They don't even smell like smoke. And Nebuchadnezzar praises them and praises his God. Verse 26, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." Verse 28 of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Okay, so that's fiery furnace. God is with these 4 men again. All right, so let's move on to the next famous story, the writing on the wall, and that's chapter 5. Okay, chapter 5. So now Nebuchadnezzar is gone. He's dead, presumably, and one of his descendants has taken over. Verse 5, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. This is probably his going away party. He knows that the Persians are on the doorstep of his kingdom. The Babylonian Empire is about to fall, and this is probably his last hurrah. Let's have a big party before everything collapses, okay? So while they are partying, verse 3, he's drinking rather heavily. So they brought in, verse 2, "While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem." Remember that? The things that they were removing from the temple, the gold things that were used in worship by the Hebrew people, he removed those. Now Belshazzar is taking those and wants to drink out of them. That's going to be a big no-no. And so they brought those things in, and he's drinking from them. While they are doing that, while they are partying it up, verse 5, "Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace." It's interesting. If you look at archaeological accounts, they found, if not this temple, one's just like it. It's really interesting. They've got, they say they can't understand it. There's one wall that's in blue, that they would expect blue tile, but then the rest of the walls are in plaster. So exactly like it's described here, written in a wall made out of plaster. So this hand appears on the wall. And I was doing some reading. They said a dead hand, that when the way that they would tally up dead soldiers was they would cut off the hand of the dead soldiers, and that's how they would tally the hand. So for us, it would be like seeing a decapitated head off of a soldier starting to talk. They don't necessarily decapitate heads anymore, but that's one of the ways they used to do that. So it'd be like the head of a dead soldier appearing and starting to talk. The hand is beginning to write. And it's not necessarily that the hand is starting to write. The hand doesn't write in a strange language, but it writes just some things about weights. And he can't understand, what does this mean? So he says, "Somebody tell me what this means." And who, lo and behold, can tell him what it means? Anybody have a guess? Daniel. That's what he has been doing over and over and over again through this book. He can interpret things that nobody else can. So Daniel appears and says, "All right, king, I can read this and I can interpret this for you." And he does so. Okay? He says, this is what it means. Verse 26, your next page of chapter 5. "God has numbered your days. your reign and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided, and your meed given to the Medes and the Persians. Not exactly good advice. So what happens later that night? The king is killed, and now the Persians are in power. So the Babylonians are out, and the Persians are in. Isn't that interesting? Here we've got, the next story is going to take place under the Persians, but here we've got a man who's been exiled. He's not even a Babylonian. He's a Hebrew. He's brought in, and he is living through two different empires. God has allowed this man to survive two different world empires. How do we survive in a culture that's different than our own? Well, Daniel had something figured out because he outlasts everybody else. He serves for nearly 70 years. He goes in as a teenager and he comes out probably in his 80s. So he survives. Daniel knew how to survive in a hostile culture. Let's really quick look at the last one, Daniel in the lion's den. How many of you have heard Daniel in the lion's den? I need to see your hands if you have. How many know about Daniel in the lion's den? Okay. How many of you haven't ever heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den? We've had a couple, so we need to cover it then, all right? So Daniel in the lion's den, okay? So again, he's not under the Babylonians anymore. This is the Persians, okay? This is the Persian king, King Darius, all right? So he's there. Daniel's plugging away again. He's probably in his 70s by now. He's survived almost 60 years of service under several different kings. When all these other people are being killed for doing the wrong thing, Daniel hangs in there, okay? So Daniel's there. But nobody likes him because they try to find ways to accuse Daniel of doing wrong things. They're like, we don't like this guy. He's different than us. He worships a different God. We need to find things that he's doing wrong. What's he doing? Well, they can't find anything. They can find nothing. He doesn't show up late for work. He doesn't skim off out of the till. He doesn't lie. He doesn't steal staples. He doesn't take pens. Whatever. He doesn't do what he's not supposed to do. They can't find anything wrong with Daniel. So they resort to religious issues. They say, well, we know he prays a lot. We know he does all these other goofy things. So let's get him on some religious things. So kind of back to the bowing down to the big statue, like the fiery furnace. They say, all right, Darius, and Darius at this point likes Daniel. He's the king that really likes Daniel, okay? And they say, all right, you need to sign this paper that says nobody can pray to anybody else but you. And so he signs it, not knowing they're trying to trap Daniel. He signs it, and they catch Daniel praying again, all right? And the king's backed in the corner, so, all right, he violated the law, so they throw him in the lion's den, okay? And these lions were hungry, and they should have chomped up and eaten Daniel, but they don't. The Lord closes the mouth of the lions, and Daniel survives. And he comes out, verse 25, King Darius, verse 23, the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den, and when Daniel was lifted out the den, no wound was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Daniel was saved out of the lion's den for continuing to do what he had always done. So those are the four big stories. So let's quickly spend about a little bit more than 2 minutes, about 3 minutes on each one. Let's quickly look at 4 points to surviving a difficult culture, a culture that doesn't make sense, okay? First point. It's a little bit longer than usual, but we'll go over a little bit today. Number 1, Daniel engages the culture around him, voluntary or otherwise. Number 1, Daniel engages the culture around him. See, Daniel wasn't there voluntarily. So you can argue, well, he wasn't there voluntarily, so he had to do this. Well, no, he doesn't. He didn't have to serve alongside the king. He could have refused to. And Jews throughout history have done that. They have refused to serve the cultures in which they are in, and Christians have refused to serve the cultures or what they are in. But Daniel doesn't do that. He chooses to engage and to serve alongside the Babylonians and alongside the Persians, okay? Now, Christians have a long history, pretty much since the Bible, since Jesus, we have a long history of withdrawing from the cultures around us, okay? We have a long history of saying, we are, and we talked about this, I think, was it last week we talked about this or 2 weeks ago? We have a long history of saying, the world is bad, we're good, we're going to withdraw and do our own thing and let essentially kind of the world go to hell in a handbasket, if you want to put it that way. We have a tendency to do that. Whether it's, your church history, Calvin, John Calvin. You ever heard of John Calvin and Calvinism, the Reformed? He set up his own little, went to Geneva, Switzerland. They set up their own little Christian community, and anybody who didn't abide by their laws, you were either killed or kicked out. We've got a history of wanting, a few years ago, there was some Christians got together in South Carolina when we lived down there. So we're going to start our own little Christian community. Only Christians can live with us, and we're going to follow God's law, and anybody who doesn't is going to get kicked out. Does that ever work? No, it never works. It's horrible. Those are terrible ideas. It doesn't work. The Amish are kind of like that, and some of the Mennonites are kind of like that. We like to establish our own little culture. Daniel didn't do that. He served right there among not only a non-Christian, well, they weren't Christian, but a pagan, hostile environment. He served right there. He was kind of the light. Jesus tells us to be what? Like a city on a hill. He tells us to be like salt, salt and light. We talked about that before. To be lights right where we are, and that's what Daniel did. So how do we survive? What's the first step to surviving a hostile place where we don't fit in? Engage. Engage the cultures in which we live in. Get to know your non-Christian neighbors. Get to know your coworkers at work who aren't Christians. Engage. Does that make sense? Everybody with me there? Engage where you are. All right, let's move on to the second point. Number 2, Daniel, and we didn't really get into this, but if you go home and read, maybe do that this week. Read the first 6 chapters of Daniel. I don't know, if you're kind of new to the Bible stuff, don't read any further than that because it gets really weird fast, okay? So stop after chapter 6, okay? Don't go any further than that. It's weird, okay? Don't come and ask me questions about it because it's really weird. All right? So stop after that. You start seeing all sorts of weird animals and things. So Daniel does the very best that he does in everything that he does, okay? He serves with excellence. Now, I'm not going to belabor this because we talked about this extensively in our Game of Life series. When we work to the Lord. Do it to the best of your ability. See, and that's exactly what Daniel did. Was Daniel serving a Christian employer or a godly king? Absolutely not. Some of these guys were ruthless. He was labeled a magician and astrologer, everything he shouldn't have been. But he did it with excellence. And he did it as hard as he could do it. He thrived at it. He thrived at what he did, okay? And he did it really, really well. If Daniel ever had a reason to complain, if anybody ever had a reason to complain, it was Daniel. See, because, we like to complain in the jobs that we are. We don't like them. So if I don't like them, maybe I don't have to work that hard. Well, Daniel wasn't even in the same country he was supposed to be in. Way back in the Old Testament, God had said, you're going to be in this land, and this is where you're going to live, and that didn't happen. They got kicked out. God let it happen because they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. So he's in a foreign land, and nothing's going right. He's in a job he probably hates, and he doesn't complain about it. He does it to the best of his ability. And again, we talked about this, so I don't want to go into that anymore. But no matter if we're in a job we love or if a job we hate, it doesn't matter. Do it to the best of your ability. That's the second step to surviving in a bad place, a hostile environment. Doing the best that you can no matter where you are. Okay, let's look at the third one. 3, Daniel doesn't bend on his convictions or God commands. And those aren't always the same thing, are they? We haven't talked about this a whole lot. But there's a difference between personal convictions and what God commands us to do, isn't there? Does anybody have some examples off the top of their head? What are some of the things that are just more of a personal thing? And what's an example of things that God tells us to do that aren't negotiable? Do you have any thoughts on that? Any examples really quick? Like, what's a non-negotiable? What's something that you can't do that? You can't be doing that stuff. Yeah, that's probably a pretty good one. I thought I'd murder my neighbor this week. He was stomping on the, he was pretty loud. I just didn't want to put up with it anymore. Now that's a pretty, that's pretty black and white. There are things that are just off limits. You just can't do. What are some things that are more black and white that the Scripture doesn't say one thing or another? It's just a personal issue. What's an example of that? Yeah, what you eat. We said that, Daisy, you've brought that up before. Here in America, it's not really a big deal what we eat, but you said in India, it's a big deal what Christians eat because they still sacrifice animals to idols in India, right? Right, Christians know, but it can be an issue of what you eat, right? So, and, if you get into church things, what music you sing, what we in North Carolina, there's people with bumper stickers that says King James only, this is the only Bible. There are things that are just, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. You can have your personal convictions. I'm not going to eat this. I'm going to read this. But it's not a law. It just depends. Okay, there's a difference between those two. All right, that's kind of a rabbit trail. But Daniel doesn't bend on his convictions. Okay, now there's something I want to bring out of here in chapter 1. Okay, chapter 1. Go back to that because this is important. This is interesting and it's worth looking into. I know I'm going a little bit over today, but hang with me because this is important. Okay, Daniel. Verse chapter 1, again, what does he do? Do you remember? He was given the food from the king's table, and what does he refuse to do? He refuses to eat it. But if you look in the same story, it's not going to be up there. If you look at the same story, in the same section, Daniel, he's assigned food. We read it in verse 1 through 7, I guess. Can you go down one more? Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so verse 4, they're given 3 things, okay? He's to be re-educated, he's to eat from the king's table, and they're given new names. So there's 3 things. He's given a new name, he's given food, and he is re-educated. And he's educated probably in their religion, which it says, and their magic. And to be renamed, people say, well, maybe he didn't do the food because eating the king's food was a sign of loyalty to the king. Well, so is being renamed. That was the same issue as to being renamed was showing loyalty as well. So he's given 3 things: a new name, new education, and new food. Yet the only thing that he protests on is what? The food. He lets the other 2 slide. Why? I don't know. I have no idea. But the issue is, Daniel decides that there are things worth fighting for and that there are things aren't. Daniel picks his battles. Okay? So the issue isn't why necessarily. I mean, there's all sorts of theories. Tom, I can't stop here. We're too late. There's all sorts of theories on why, but that's not the issue. The issue is he picked his battles. Okay? Daniel picks his battles. Not everything is worth standing up for if it's a personal issue. I mean, you just can't. You can burn too many bridges. You can turn too many people off. Daniel couldn't have been, I don't think he could have been successful if he refused everything. But I think the bigger issue is he accepts some things, but at a point he says, I just can't do that. I just can't. I can only accept so many accommodations. I can only accommodate so far without being associated 100% with the culture. I think that's the bigger thing. At some point we draw the line. What is that line? I don't know. It could be different for each person, okay? But Daniel draws the line somewhere, and he does it here. The other interesting one is, what about his prayer? The Daniel in the lion's den, he refused to quit praying. They said, don't pray anymore. Could he have just stopped praying in front of his, because if you read the story, we didn't get into it, but he prays kind of wherever, in front of his window, and they were spying on him. He could have prayed in a more secret place, but he didn't. Could he have? Would God have cared? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If he'd have stopped praying, is that... I don't know. These are gray issues. But Daniel navigates the waters, and he stays faithful to God. Okay? These are difficult issues, aren't they? I mean, sometimes we can be asked to do things that it's just a gray area. At work, sometimes we can be asked to do things that are just not unethical, but, what do we do? Daniel's asked to do things that aren't necessarily unethical, but they're difficult to navigate. That's just life. What battles do we pick? What battles do we pick to fight? And I have a guess. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego spent a lot of time talking with each other about these things and praying with each other about them. I bet they spent a lot of time over those things. What do we do? How do we do this? How do we want to present ourselves? All right, lastly, Daniel gives glory to God for his successes. Lastly, how do we navigate a difficult culture? We don't compromise on our convictions or God's law. It can be difficult to navigate, but we stand firm like Daniel did. And then lastly, we give God thanks and credit for our success. Every time Daniel interpreted a dream, every time he had a success for the king, every time he was delivered, whether it was the fiery furnace or the writing on the wall, or whether they looked better after eating the lower grade food or after the lion's den, he said, it wasn't me, it was God. And we can do that, can't we? As much as sometimes professional athletes can come across looking like God cares about who wins the Super Bowl or who wins a baseball game or not, sometimes you got to give them credit. At least they give God credit for the success that they have. Okay? Do we give God the credit for success when we have it? God, it wasn't me. God was working through me, and that's what Daniel did. Daniel gives God credit for his successes, and we can do that as well. So, what are our four things for navigating a difficult society? The first one was what? Engaging the culture around us. Okay. The second one was what? Doing the best in all that we do. The third one was not bending, setting those standards and staying true to them. And the last one is giving God glory for our successes. Daniel made it in a hostile environment through many kings, 2 different empires for almost 70 years. He outlived practically like everybody else who was native and everything. He did it well. We can do the same. We can not only survive, but we can thrive when things get difficult by being faithful to God, by kind of following the example that Daniel set for us and being faithful to Christ and being faithful to God. So thank you for hanging with me in this extra long sermon today. We covered a lot of material. I don't see anybody dozing off, so that's good. So thank you for hanging with me. Let's stand here this morning. Father, thank you for being here with us. Let the message of Daniel sink into our hearts and our minds, that we can know how to navigate and learn how to navigate through a culture which is our home, but which always doesn't feel like we belong. Help us to be able to walk that line and be faithful to you, and be able to come through like Daniel did and say, I did it well, and I give you the glory. May that be our testimony, Lord. Give us the power, give us the strength to do that, give us the courage that we may do it as individuals and as a group here, as a church, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.